Good morning. This is Odessa Wesleyan Church. This is our journey through the Bible. And it is October the 5th. And today we're going to be looking at 2 Kings, chapter 10 through 16, and 1 Chronicles 19 through 24.
Did you say 1 Chronicles?
2 Chronicles, I'm sorry. So as you're reading through this, from about this point on, especially in Chronicles, you're going to see like very limited information about Israel, like little tiny paragraphs, or even, in some instances, sentences, it seems like very vague. Like all of a sudden we went from, and the Kings, we see a lot of detail. And then 1 Chronicles, we saw a lot of detail. And then 2 Chronicles, especially when it applies to Israel, we don't see a lot of detail. And like, what's going on here? So realize again that the book of Chronicles was finally compiled about 100 years after the exile of Judah, and about 150, 200 years after the destruction of Israel by the Assyrians. So the thing with the Assyrians, and we'll talk a lot more detail comparing the Assyrians' approach to life and conquering versus the Greeks, the Romans, the Babylonians, and other people groups that will appear. That the Assyrians, their outlook on life was they were the people and everybody else was not the people. So when they conquered a land, they annihilated memory of the conquered people. That meant the historical, because they felt that our gods gave us the power over the rest of the world. So therefore you aren't powerful. You're not important to live. I mean, they were very intent on slaughtering everybody, but they would tear down the temples. They would destroy the government records. They would annihilate everything. And then what they would do is they would exile, and we'll talk about this. I'm sorry, my computer started to do timeout here. We don't want to do that. They would exile the people groups in the area they just conquered, pull them off to the capital to re-educate them, in a modern term. And then they would take people who had been conquered a generation before and move them into the land. And a little bit of foreshadowing to the New Testament, that when Israel was destroyed, and this happened under the Assyrian Empire, you had these people living around this area called Samaria. And Jesus encountered these people living around Samaria. They were called Samaritans. And we'll talk a little bit more of how that religion developed, because again, the people, who were brought into these lands being very centric on worship of God, said, well, things are happening to us, so we need to figure out the gods that were in charge of this land before we were sent here, and we need to adopt. And that's how the Samaritans and their religion, adopting the Jewish culture, started to develop, because they started researching, they started developing, what is this God here in this area? So that's the reason why we don't see a lot in Chronicles from this point on about, really about Israel. We don't really see a lot of detail. So the one thing that we need to really know from this point on, and we've seen where Judah and Israel is given very clear to Jeroboam when he led his rebellion, that not to fight against Judah. And Judah was told not to fight against Israel. Even though you're two separate nations now, you're still brothers. You still worship the God, your heritage. So don't fight against each other. And we see conflicts, little minor skirmishes, or we see a little bit of subtlety where a Judah king will have an ally who, okay, I'm not going to fight against Israel, but this king is going to fight over here and I'm going to be kind of his vassal. And the same thing across the border. But from about this point on in history, that the Israel kings fall so far away from their heritage and so far away from God that they look at Judah as enemies. And so there's this conflict that's going to happen. So we see a fall here in Omri's dynasty. And remember that Omri was a fulfillment of prophecy against Jeroboam, because God allowed Jeroboam to split the nation. That the point is punishment to Solomon because of Solomon's flirting around with these false gods and not giving total loyalty to God, even though God blessed him. That Jeroboam, the idea was still to worship God, but then Jeroboam created this false religion, these two golden cows worship, and so God told him that there will come a time when nobody will, serve, as king. Nobody will have any authority at your family. And that was fulfilled through Omri. Well, again, you would think that Omri, because God, prophesied that he would come and he would lead the people, he would be the king, that he would serve God. Well, remember the phrase that we see a lot. He didn't think all the things that Jeroboam did, all the evil, creating this false religion, was anything. He went farther. And then his son arose, or his grandson arose, Ahab. And Ahab, and when we were talking about Elijah and Elisha, we saw Ahab, how he married Jezebel, who was not just a priestess of the Sidonians, but she was, or a princess of the Sidonians, but she was a priestess, meaning that she instituted this total false religion, and not just instituted, but said anybody who dares to worship, the true God of Israel, the true God of Judah, I'm going to kill you. If you say you're a priest, if you say you're a servant of him, your sentence is death. That she tried to change the culture and tried to change the religion of the people. So Ahab eventually goes to war. He kind of coerces the king of Israel into a war with him, and they're defeated by early form of the Assyrians, before the Assyrian Empire really starts to take shape. In the Assyrian Empire, we see, again, our modern words, sometimes we come up with names, and especially the 20th and the 21st century, of places that really weren't. So don't get confused with Syria, the nation that we talk about in today's headlines, as the Assyrians. That was part of their kingdom, but actually the Assyrians, you will find more in what we would call today modern Turkey. That was they were kind of maybe Southern Russian, more if you want to talk ethnically, that they were up here and consolidated their power. And like every other, in humankind, we're not satisfied with just our territory. We want to expand and expand. Well, there's, again, remember the three roads. There's this big, vast, trove of riches down south in Ethiopia and Egypt, what we would call today, North Africa, Northwest Africa, and, Southwest, the western part of Africa. You have this big bunch of resources of mines and gold. The Assyrians already control the end of the road going to India and going to the Far East. Well, why not control the north-south routes as well? So that's what happened. The Assyrians started creeping down in. And so again, first we try to fight against them. These people who own a good chunk of the populace, and Ahab goes to the king of Judah and says, well, these guys want to conquer us, and not just conquer, because remember what I said. Their idea of conquering was annihilation. So either we fight together against them, or one at a time we're going to fall to them. Well, they try fighting against them. And even though a prophet approached the two kings as they were getting ready to go in battle and said, don't go to war. God will protect you. Just rely on him. Don't go to war. Because we'd seen this happen a few times to Ahab, where, his city was besieged. And then the next morning, wake up and all they see is dead bodies, and not one drop of Israelite blood was slain, simply because God, took these different people groups, created a conflict. One time they got scared, rumors flew through and they all, ran away. Another time they turned on each other, annihilated each other. So, we see this. Well, eventually Ahab, again, not getting through to his thick skull that God will protect him if he remains faithful, if he acknowledges him. He goes to battle anyway. He said, well, we've defeated these Assyrians twice now, which they didn't, but, sometimes we get a little prideful in our actions. And so then what happens? Ahab gets wounded in battle, and he goes back to Samaria, and he eventually dies of his wounds. And so then what happens is one of his generals says, hey, we just got defeated in battle. Why? Because God told a prophet to tell the kings not to do this. The same prophet, and we don't see the name there, but we believe that it was Elisha, had anointed Jehu, the general of the Israelite army, and said, you are going to be the next king. You're going to deal God's justice, and you're going to eliminate any rule of Ahab, Omri's dynasty. And so Jehu started a civil war, and he went and defeated any of those who supported Ahab. And we see that in 1 Kings chapter 10. Now, the problem was that Jezebel wasn't giving up her throne. So Jezebel ruled for a short time period as a queen regent because her and her Ahab's son, was still alive. So she was trying to bide her time until he was reached adulthood so she could place him on the throne. Well, that didn't happen. So what does Jehu do? Well, in chapter 10, 28 through 35, we see the account that in verse 31, or 30 to 31, that Jehu went through and eliminated this false worship of Baal and said, we need to return to God. But the problem in verse 31, he wasn't totally 100% committed, but he did do a great amount of good and tried to get Israel back to their heritage, back to their culture, back to the true religion they were supposed to move. So we're going to kind of pause there for this week with Israel, and we're going to move back to Judah. And again, we're throwing a lot of names here, but in the Synoptic Bible, it has a really good timeline where you could see overlaps of kings. And then back here on our map, you can see that as well. So we come to Jehoshaphat, and Jehoshaphat, again, being a Judaic king, he had a true heart for God. That if you notice in 2 Chronicles 19, looking at verses 4 through 11, you see some of the things he did. That he appointed the priests. Now, this is kind of a neat thing. He reinstated the Leviticate judges. That sounds like that we don't really know when this ended or phased out, but it sounded like the seat of justice. If you wanted justice, whether it was civil or criminal, you went to the capital, Jerusalem. You presented yourself before the king. Instead of how God had set up the nation, that telling them that the priests in each town were also the judges. And if you needed justice, you went to them. And then Samuel, had just judges under him, but Samuel acted as the chief judge, and like Eli, his predecessor. But for some reason, that seemed to fade. That the power kind of went back towards the king. Well, what Jehoshaphat did is he reinstituted this, that he appointed the priests as also the judges for justice. So you would start in your small town, and then you would go maybe to the capital region, and then you would eventually present yourself before the high priest and the king for the ultimate justice. And I like what he said. He didn't just institute this, but this is when he consecrated them. If you look at verse 6, this is what he says to them. Consider carefully what you do, because you are not judging for mere mortals, but for the Lord, who is with you whenever you give a verdict. Now let the fear of the Lord be on you. Judge carefully for the Lord, for he is our God. There is no injustice. There's to be no injustice or partiality or bribery. That's pretty strong covenant that these guys have to go towards. And so that kind of tells us, the heart of Jehoshaphat here, that later down he, tells people as he appoints more leaders to serve faithfully and wholeheartedly in fear of the Lord in verse 9. So Jehoshaphat led a spiritual revival, and he reinstituted the authority of the chief priest, because up until this point, we started to see that you had the king, you had the religious leaders, and they kind of stayed out of each other's business. But the purpose that God, set up the nation from the very, very, very beginning was that there was no separation. There was no civil way to live, that's civil as in, man's laws. And then you live differently for God's laws. That God's laws are the authority, and civil law is based on God's laws, and they influence. There's no separation. There's no dualistic life that is all together. But that had faded away, and we see where that creates. I can go at the king worships Baal, so I'm going to go worship Baal. But the king also, says that I'm going to, do the feasts, do the prerequisite, things as well, instead of the purpose of God says this. And whether you're in the court, whether you're in the everyday life, whether you're in the temple, whether you're before the king, whether you're in the marketplace, you are to live for God in all ways, in all things. And so I guess I'm going to use the word unique, because unfortunately, as we look at the whole history here, the king led by example. God said he was faithful and he trusted God. And he looked at the system of justice that was supposed to be there, and he establishes that. And 2 Chronicles 20 talks about how he relied on God, even when faced with, great challenges. That again, that he allies with Jehoshaphat because they see this threat of the Assyrians. They gather their armies. He's there with Ahab. And then he hears the prophet saying, don't go fight against these. So Jehoshaphat stands back and watches God's miraculous, saving from this powerful army. So then he passes away, and his son Jehoram becomes king of Judah. Now, this is where we see the problem with alliances. That Jehoram was the son-in-law to Ahab. You already see the problem that's going to happen here? That his father said, let's create an alliance here. How's the best way to keep alliance? From you attacking my country and me attacking your country? Well, let's have our kids get married. And then our grandkids, who may want to go fight against each other, wait a minute, we're family, so let's not do this. Usually that works. Sometimes it doesn't. And again, I know I reference the Civil War, and even I'm reading a book right now on Revolutionary War, how you will see in American history that sometimes that may have been a good idea, but in reality, it doesn't when people really get ideas, because you see in the Civil War, you see in the American Revolutionary War, where you had families, brothers fighting brothers. You had, fathers fighting sons. You had relatives fighting each other. But you kind of start, so, they started with this, well, let's have Ahab's daughter marry the future king, and, maybe we'll have peace. Well, so unlike his father, he was not faithful to God. He reintroduced Baal worship back into, as not just we're going to worship Baal, but that's the official religion. That he took his mother's influence, Jezebel, and said, we're going to reject this God of Judah. Our God is now Baal. Part of that was, again, not offering excuse, just an explanation, is the Assyrians worship Baal, and the Assyrians seem to be pretty successful, pretty prosperous. Well, then maybe there's something about this. So let's take them on, and maybe they'll like us. If we live like them, maybe they'll get along and like us. Well, the lesson that we can even apply to our very today. It's very easy to look at culture. It's very easy to look at things and stymie our beliefs, stymie what we know is right in order to have peace and get along, because that doesn't work. It doesn't work. That the tiny little compromises lead to bigger compromises, lead to bigger compromises. One of the proverbs that Solomon wrote was, be careful of little foxes in the vineyards. And we're like, what does that mean? Well, if you tolerate the little fox nibbling here and there on a grape, guess what happens? More and more foxes come, and more foxes come, and all of a sudden your grape harvest is no more. And Solomon's point was, be careful of the little compromises. That trying to get along with your next door neighbor by taking on their lifestyle and their beliefs and their culture isn't the way to go when you're supposed to be serving God wholly, honestly, and truly. That goes back to the very first commandment. Remember, we talk about this, in my paraphrase of it. Love God. Love God 100%. Serve God, honor God. And clearly this wasn't something new. This goes all the way back to Adam. God renews this expectation of serve me only, and I will bless you. And we see this in Noah. We see this in Abraham. We see this in Jacob. And then we hear these words given by Moses. And part of it, and this is the weird thing that, we just witnessed the coronation last year of King Charles. And you see that it's a lot of religious symbolism and acts there. The same thing was still going on in Judah, and especially Judah, where this covenant was renewed in front of the new leader. But yet he had no intention of doing it. And what happens is, because when you fail to honor God, you can't expect the blessings to happen. And so Elijah's still alive this time. Elijah writes a letter to Jerome and says, you're rejecting God. God is rejecting you. And so what happens? I like his epitaph here, that, he doesn't listen. And so God strikes him, gives him this disease to try to gain his attention. Still doesn't listen. And then at 32 years old, he only reigned for 8 years. So at 40 years old, listen here to 2 Chronicles 21, verse 20. He passed away to no one's regret and was buried in the city of David, but not in the tombs of the king. Think about that. Hey, the king's dead. All right, about time. like a sigh of relief that nobody mourned the king. And so much so, he wasn't buried where the rest of the kings were in a place of honor. He was just buried in a tomb, just like a commoner. Why? Because he had this example of his father of how to live faithfully and saw this revival. And what does he do? He wants to fit in with his neighbors. He wants to try to play the power game and wholeheartedly reject God. So we see here in also the scripture a note, the Philistines are back in. That David hadn't totally, he defeated the Philistines, but the Philistines start to creep back in power. And then we also start to see another people group. We see this mention of Arabs. And these were nomads from the western deserts that were starting to move from the very far western deserts closer and closer. That they had trade with the people groups around them, but they were slowly becoming, I don't want to use the word civilized, but more locked to a certain geographical area, starting to settle down, go from nomads to actually established places, and they start to move in. These are the same people groups that you will see mentioned in Ezra and Nehemiah that lived around the outskirts of Judah and Israel and kind of mingled with them. And eventually, when those two nations would be destroyed, would move in and were placed there by the Assyrians and the Babylonian empires. So these groups will have some influence later on in history. So 2 Chronicles 22 talks about Ahaz. Ahaz is the youngest son of the king, because in this great battle that happens and everything, for some reason, we don't know why the youngest son became the king. Whether the older sons, looked like they were going to continue on the same, way of rejecting God as Jahaz did or not. We really don't know, but for some reason, the youngest son was placed upon the throne. He only reigned 1 year. And
what was his name?
Ahaz.
Ahaz. Okay.
And he was as evil as his father. Now that's something. Again, a guy who, rejects the true God of Judah, who institutes Baal that they were told not to do, and he is as evil as his father. He is weakened by battle wounds. And then Jehu, who, again, by this point, leads a rebellion of Ahab's family and who establishes a new dynasty in Israel, actually comes in. This is how, successful and how intent Jehu was initially to serving God, that not only does he try to reinstate the true worship of God in Israel, he comes into Jerusalem and into Judea and establishes that he sets up, a new king that will rule. But the problem was that you had Attila in 2 Chronicles 22:10. She was the mother of Ahaz. And she saw that her son died. So she decided, again, you notice that in Israel and in Judah, we never see queens rule. Well, she tried to take rule of the family, but she realized, again, that she's not going to be in power that long. So what does she do? Does she turn her heart towards God? Does she try to appease Jehu? Nope. What she ends up doing is massacring any potential heir in Judah. And she ruled for the next six years that she was going to eliminate the house of David. Because remember that God gave this promise to David that one of your descendants will always rule over my people. So she decided, well, maybe the best way to get these people's hearts totally towards our religion and totally rejecting this God of Judah is let's just eliminate the whole line. Let's break this promise. This God says that these, one of these people are going to rule. No, they're not. I'm just going to kill them all. And not only did she try to eliminate the house of David from existence, she closed the temple. That this is one of the things all these other kings who, yes, they may have been trying to worship Baal, they never closed the temple doors. What Attila does is she closes the doors. She literally, says, no more sacrifices, no more worship, no more festivals, no more priests, no more high priests, and she put them all to death. That she continued this evil that we saw definitely going on in Israel, and as Omri's families became kings in Judah, that they introduced. So now we come to a great time, and especially Israel's history and Judah's history, that we see great bloodshed and upheaval. There's going to be civil war within each nation. There's going to be wars against each nation. You're going to start to see alliances being made with one people group with intent to destroy the other nation, and vice versa. You're going to start to see that the Egyptians are going to start to creep north. We're going to see the Syrians. You're going to if you look at human history, you start to see about Babylon being resurrected. These Babylonians start to have military might, and they start to creep. And so the north, over the next few centuries, you're going to see two great kingdoms, the Assyrians and the Babylonians fight. And then a little while later, the Babylonians and the Persians and what we would call the Medes fight. And the Egyptians, will start to come. And where do they all converge again? On these three trade routes that go to the big resources in the south, the big resources in the north, and who is in the middle of it? This little nation of Israel, this little nation of Judah. And you will start to see a lot of what we would call ancient history happens in this little section of the world. And kind of the point to keep in mind that, and this is not a political statement, this is a historical statement I'm about to make. The headlines we see today about this little section of the world is the same descendants 8,000 years ago, 7,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago. It's the same descendants in conflict. This section of the world has always been in conflict through human history because of its connections to the other resources of greater people groups. This seems to be the place where battle is fought. And we're going to see this over the next few weeks. So we're going to leave it here. We're with Jehu in Israel, trying to reform the people, trying to bring the people back to worship of God, but not just Israel, but also into Judah. And then we're going to leave it here where you have this bloodthirsty queen that is going to wants to annihilate the memory, even the thought of worship of the true God of Judah. And obviously, she doesn't like what Jehu is doing over in Israel either. We're going to leave this conflicted, kind of pretty bleak, that I could leave us here with, this is not a great time in history. This is, there's no hope here. But let me read in conclusion here. 2 Kings chapter 11, verses 1 through 3. When Attila, the mother of Ahaz, saw that her son was dead, she proceeded to destroy the whole Roman family. But Jehoshaphat, the daughter of the king of Jehoram, and the sister of Ahaz, took Joash, the son of Ahaz, and stole him away among the royal princes who were about to be murdered. She put him and his nurse in a bedroom to hide him from Attila, so that he was not killed. She remained hidden with the nurse at the temple of the Lord for 6 years, while Attila ruled the land. So there's a glimmer of hope that the queen at the time realized that her husband's dead, realized that her mother-in-law's intent on destroying everything. So she hides her child, who's an infant, a newborn, in the temple. Remember the temple that's closed? And we're assuming that she was probably killed in this, this bloodthirsty rampage that Attila had. But the priest raised the future king. This infant, saved from death, being raised by priests in the temple, he will bring faithfulness to God back to Judah and to Israel. So this phrase we use a lot around here, and you've heard it a lot if you're following along with the study, but we use it here in Odessa Wesleyan a lot, is based in biblical teachings. But God. When hope seems lost, when enemies who are intent on shedding your blood and wiping out the memory of God, just remember, but God. As God promised Elijah, and Elijah's like, look at all I've done, and what have I accomplished? Nothing. God says, but I have people who are faithful. When Attila's out there trying to annihilate the whole royal family, trying to annihilate the priests and the worship of the true God, but God, if you remain faithful, God has his protection and his provision for you. And we're going to see what happens here. And it has a great impact on both these nations. So next week, we're going to look at 2 Kings 11 through 14. 2 Kings 11 through 14. And then 2 Chronicles 22 through 25. 2 Chronicles 22 through 25.
Okay.
All right, let's close in prayer, and you guys have a good week.
And then next week will be the 7th or the
12th,
12th.
right?
12th, yeah.
Yes, 12th. Heavenly Father, thank you for giving us the strength to be faithful. Thank you for your protection, that we can stand and follow you and believe you. In your name, amen.
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 Thank you for watching.
It kept going in and out. I will update you on that. I could see where it.
It still records, even though it says trying to reconnect. It
Oh,
doesn't.
good.
It doesn't break. There's just like a little glitch in the recording. So we just let it go.